Thank you for having me here today. I'm very excited to talk to you about simulating the future, which is a topic that's near and dear to me as a quote unquote futurist. I'll get a little bit more into what it means to simulate the future, and we'll look at some scenarios for how that could actually work, the kinds of futures that we could simulate. And then we'll wrap up with a little bit on the metaverse. So today, I want to start off with looking at a story called "The Toynbee Vector," which is a sci-fi short story from Ray Bradbury. And in this story, essentially what happens is that a time traveler goes 100 years into the future and gets very excited because the future is completely transformed. We've achieved everything that we've wanted to achieve, and we've gotten rid of all of the negative things in society. So we have eliminated disease, and we have overcome climate change. We fixed things like our population and how it relates to each other, and the trials that we have when we try to get along in a society. We've done great feats of accomplishment as well. We've not only gone to Mars, we've also gone to Alpha Centauri. And so he brings back all of this evidence from the future, and that includes films and recordings and photographs. And he shows it to the billions of people on Earth and essentially says, look, we've achieved the future. Not only is a brighter future possible, but it's inevitable. We're going to get there no matter what we do. And so, in that excitement, people essentially start to rush towards the future. We start to build the things that we're supposed to and, live our lives the way we're supposed to. And 100 years pass in the process. And the time traveler has been quiet this entire time. And so the 100 years pass, and then on the centennial anniversary of his visit, he comes out and reveals, well, actually, it was all fake. He tells this to a journalist. None of it was real. I faked all the evidence. I built little models and I recorded those and I showed that to everybody and pretended like that was the future that we were going to end up having. And by doing that, he essentially created a self-fulfilling prophecy. And he did it because the world was in despair. There was a lot of things that were wrong, and it was hard to see past all of the things that we didn't want towards the things that we did want. And so by creating this vision of the future, he essentially allowed people to believe it was real, imagine those possibilities, and then act on them towards making them real, making them essentially a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I like to think that if this story was written by Ray Bradbury today, that evidence that he brings back from the future would also include XR technology. And if it was written a few years from now, it would definitely include XR and metaverse technologies. So before we go any further into what this means for simulating the future and how we can take inspiration from this story, I want to talk to you a little bit about what I do. So I said at the beginning of this keynote that my title is quote unquote a futurist, but really what I actually do is a practice called strategic foresight. And strategic foresight is all about exploring multiple alternative futures in order to understand what actions that we should take in the present are. So we look at things like signals from the future, fringe data, that tells us that the future might be different than what it is in the present. So if we think back 20 years ago, the mRNA technique that has transformed the world and saved us really from a pandemic that could have been much worse, that idea, that vaccine, that technology existed in the form of a research paper that was very much so on the fringe and wasn't really accepted by mainstream science. And so that little signal had an opportunity to land in the context of a pandemic when the conditions for it were right, and become not only transformative in terms of what we're doing today, but transformative for pharmacology in the future. And then we take all of that evidence that includes, also trends and also things called driving forces, which are those bigger forces of change like demographic changes and climate change, things like that. And we create scenarios. So out of those scenarios, we're looking at multiple possibilities. We try to think about what the alternatives could be. Maybe if the future goes in one direction versus another, what is it that we're kind of looking at? And sometimes that includes, looking at collapse scenarios, but it also includes looking at transformative scenarios where society undergoes a paradigm shift. And oftentimes it's a high spirited paradigm shift. And so that is essentially done for us to give us an opportunity to step into the future. And then the last step is to really think about strategy. What does it mean to include that future as a part of our considerations for what we do today? And how do we act towards the future so that we are bringing about the things that we want and preventing the things that we don't want? And it's not really about making predictions. So we're not trying to say the future will be this one thing. That's really why we focus on the multiple and creating many possibilities. Predicting the future can be good when we have lots of scientific data or high quality data. And so forecasting is really useful for doing things like thinking about climate change or thinking about how COVID cases might play out. We can look at the data there and we can make some very reasonable predictions about how things might go if we act in one way versus another. Foresight is fundamentally the opposite of that. So what we're doing is we're actually starting in the future. We're thinking about the multiple possibilities and how those could play out. And then we're working backwards towards thinking about what does that mean for the present day. And so if we look at a problem like COVID, forecasting can tell us the case counts and how those might play out. Foresight might tell us how does society respond, and what does it mean to have a more conservative government versus a more progressive, socially oriented government. What does it mean to compare, a government led by, let's say, Jacinda Ardern versus Donald Trump? We saw how the realities of COVID played out very differently under those two governments. And so that's the kind of thing that we might want to explore under foresight. What happens when the world goes in one direction or another? And what are these uncertainties, things that are really hard to predict that we can't really see coming? Can we explore them in some way before they might happen? And so one aspect of the work is called experiential futures. And that is what Stuart Candy calls situations and stuff from the futures. So instead of talking about an abstract scenario and saying, climate change is going to be really bad and it's going to affect lots of people, what we want to do is immerse people in that future instead and say, it's happening to you. What does it mean, for instance, if we were to create a simulation in which I'm sitting in my home and suddenly water rushes in and starts to fill up the room? How is that a more impactful way of talking about climate change, for instance, instead of talking about, let's say, statistics or numbers, which are harder to grasp and harder to form a bond with and really understand in our minds, what does that mean? And so we simulate the future for a variety of different reasons. One of them is to create that more visceral and immediate connection with the future and understand the implications of what that future might be before it actually happens to us. So it gives us a sense of our consequences before they have a chance to do something to our lives that we maybe don't want, or also, on the other hand, to try on and practice the future before it becomes a reality as well. So when I think back to that simulation, right now NASA has a simulation around climate change where you can look at the map of the world and you can toggle between what's happening right now and what's the reality 100 years from now, and you can see how the coastlines are affected as you move back and forth from the present day to the future. So that's a very high level abstraction. When we do that, it's really hard to grasp what that means. But again, if I were to sit in my living room and imagine the water flooding in because I'm in an area that could potentially be affected, that has a very different experience and impact on me. So really, ultimately, what we're able to do is go from empathy to multisensory experience because we're engaging directly with the future. And of course, XR and metaverse technology will play a role in that because it allows us to bring that future to life in a much more tangible way. So if we think about a VR experience versus, me creating a scenario for you, obviously one of those things is going to be more impactful on the senses, and it will be probably more entrenched in our memories as a result of that as well. And so having that ability to immerse ourselves in different futures and in different worlds essentially means that XR and metaverse technology is a time machine. We've given ourselves a version of a time machine that's not exactly transporting us to the actual future, but it can transport us to many futures in a much safer way. We don't actually have to leave our homes to experience what the future could be and what different worlds might look like. So in a way, we've achieved effectively what the Toyin beacon vector is trying to convey in terms of a time traveler going to the future. And now what we have is an opportunity to create those visions of what the future might look like, based in evidence, based on what we're seeing today, and then play out those different scenarios and think about what the impact for us could be. And I think that's a very massive thing that could potentially change society, because rather than talking about the future as an abstraction, we really get to immerse ourselves in it and understand what that means for us. And I think in being able to do that, we might make some different decisions about the world and where we're headed. And so you'll see that there's a bit of an overlap here between what I do in terms of experiential futures and this concept of creating, simulations of the future. And ultimately, for me, it comes down to world building. So I talk a lot about world building as creating a complex prototype of the future. And we effectively think comprehensively about the system that might exist, and I think that allows for greater coherence and greater immersion. And certainly, we see this in as a consideration when we're talking about the metaverse, particularly when we talk about gaming worlds. But really, the concept of world building is something we have to think about actively right now, as we're at the forefront of this technology and can have greater influence on it as it's being developed. So I have a particular way that I build worlds. I think about the system from a first principles perspective, and I think about it from these 7 angles. What does it really mean to inhabit each of these angles? So if we talk about the political reality of our world, we need to think about what the future political reality might be, and if there's better systems out there that we haven't considered as of yet that we could potentially inhabit, and so on and so forth. So we'll look at science and technology, art, social, philosophical, environmental, and economic as well. And so these particular angles allow us to think about the world fundamentally and then build up from there. So again, we're letting go of the world as we know it, and we're thinking about new constructions and how those could potentially play out. And so I want to share 3 simulations, forecasts from the future, with you that could potentially be applications of XR and metaverse technology that we want to consider. And each of these that you're going to see are nuanced. So there's good things about them. There's also bad things about them, and we have to consider the positives and negatives as well. And so the first one is simulated seeds and species. As biodiversity loss accelerates, we turn to the metaverse to preserve our most critical ecosystems before they collapse. Instead of trying to replicate reality, we design and simulate new keystone species, so fundamental species to the ecosystems, that trigger trophic cascades, powerful indirect actions that control entire ecosystems. We simulate seeds that are resistant to wildfires, maybe empress bees that give us hyper hives, and plastic phylic corals that absorb and convert waste. Real-time rendering and digital twins of the Earth allow us to map potential impacts of these new species before they're released out into the wild. And really, only the species that have maximum positive impacts and environmental benefits are released into the world. Eco-design and simulations are at the forefront of environmental degradation. So obviously, there's some positives there in terms of XR providing a powerful solution to really geoengineer and engage with the environment in a way that we haven't been able to before. But obviously, there's negatives to this scenario as well, because it means things have gone wrong if we're getting to that point. And what does it mean to meddle in the environment in ways that we don't fully understand, but that XR might help us understand a little bit better. So lots of things to think about there. The next thing or the next scenario that I want to walk you through is identity try-ons. So identity try-ons is essentially what it says it is. We can step into different identities and different avatars before we make any sort of decisions in our lives, and that can take on a variety of different formats. We might want to look into things like relationship building, how it is that we relate to different people. So, for instance, a study in avatars showed that white students who embodied Black avatars in a VR environment experienced a decrease in their implicit bias. We might want to think about our careers in this factor in this way as well. So, what does it mean to embody a different career than the one that we have? Or if I'm younger, let's say I'm in university and I'm trying to understand where my future might go, I might want to try on different identities before I invest in any of them. So, we found that in another study that engineering students had increased creativity and ideation after being immersed in a VR environment where they were embodying an avatar that resembled an inventor. And so we can see how these different identities might impact us. And one of the identities could potentially be our future selves as well. We've seen VR experiments with, looking at our aged self and thinking about what it means for that aged self to retire. So we're more likely to invest more in our retirement and our future selves when we're able to see them and engage with them. And so essentially, trying on an identity might shift our behavior in the present, and it might allow us to make different decisions based on where we are today. So I think this is a really exciting possibility. And of course, there's downsides to it as well. What does it mean to embody an identity that's so different from our own that we don't necessarily have a hard time relating, but that we can never actually become because of our actual present day circumstances. So I might want to try on a particular career, but let's say that my financial circumstances don't allow me to get to a point where I can actually be in that career. So things to think about, some nuances as we're designing these things. And finally, I'm going to introduce you to mind palaces. This is keeping a familiar routine in a recognizable place is a helpful way to care for people with dementia. So, the idea of mind palaces being this place that we step into where we're storing all of our information. We might have memories in there. We might have experiences stored in there, but really it could play a completely different role for disease management, especially when we start to think about things like Alzheimer's and dementia. And these places don't necessarily need to be physical locations. Of course, with Metaverse and XR technology, we can recreate spaces from any time. And so we can create spaces capable of reflecting changes over years. At first, a simple photo and video documentation is used to create AI generated replicas. Over time, mind palaces become popular in their own right, and we build them for fun. We take 3D snapshots of our spaces, upload them to supplementary material, along with supplementary material like voice notes, text messages, and entertainment, and enjoy in the particular moments that we enjoy in our lives. Millions suffer from dementia, and these mind palaces become critical spaces in easing stress on patients and their loved ones, the latter of whom are able to take on avatars of their younger versions of themselves and maybe seem more familiar to the patient. For the rest of us, these palaces become time capsules capturing our lives with an immersive richness never before possible. And so what it means to collect our lives, to store our memories, to store our experiences over time could actually have a benefit that we haven't really thought about yet. And that benefit in terms of, what it means if I, for instance, develop dementia, that's a potential that hasn't been explored and could be very powerful for us. So something to think about. And again, there may be negative consequences here as well. And we need to think through those implications as well before we rush towards creating this future. And so, really, what the potential of metaverse and XR technology in terms of the future is that we might mitigate crisis, but we can also imagine new possibilities. And so, we want to do a little bit of both. It's not just that we want to avoid the disasters; it's also that we want to think about, what we could create in the world that doesn't exist that is highly desirable and beneficial to us all. And if you want to learn more about forecasts and see more forecasts that are related to the metaverse, please visit multiversedesign.com. There you'll see a link to a report called Portals, and in it there are 12 forecasts of the future, including a couple of the ones that you saw today. So I invite you to do that, and hopefully, when you have a chance to engage in some of these ideas from the future, it inspires you to think about what simulations you might create, how you might address some of the world's challenges, and how you might engage with the world around you today, that is informed from a different perspective, and maybe that will lead us to make better decisions for all of us. Thank you.